Srila Prabhupada Lilamrta, Volume 1, A Lifetime in Preparation, India, 1896 to 1965. A biography of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, by Satsvarup Das Goswami. Foreword. It is a distinct and unusual honor for me to be asked to write a foreword to this eloquent and informative biography of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. To my great regret, I never met him during his sojourn here in America, but I feel that I have met him. The spiritual reality of a great teacher lives on in many ways, not the least in the lives of those he has touched. Since I have come to know many of Srila Prabhupada's disciples over the past years, as well as many devotees who were influenced by him without knowing him personally, I sense a certain acquaintanceship. To write this foreword seems then in some measure like introducing a friend. Although it is not true to say in all cases that a religious movement is the shadow of a great teacher, still, there is some measure of truth even in that familiar statement. It will surely help readers of this book and understand ISKCON better to know the man who founded it and to be aware of the soil from which he comes. The patience and care with which the author of this volume has reconstructed the long life Srila Prabhupada had already lived even before he set forth for America makes for absorbing and inspiring reading. I read it, I confess, not just because of my own interest in Srila Prabhupada, but because the milieu the author recreates tells us so much more than a mere life story could. It reminds us of how very ensconced Srila Prabhupada was in one of the oldest religious traditions in the world. It recalls how very much went on in the generations, centuries, and even millennia before him that seems to be gathered and focused in his life and in his teaching. In one sense, Srila Prabhupada was not at all original, and reading the story of his life raises questions about our typical Western proclivity to attach such value to originality. What the book makes clear, on the contrary, is that Srila Prabhupada is a man who incarnates an ancient tradition. The opening verses of the 4th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, the Indian text most precious to ISKCON, teach that the ageless science of Bhakti Yoga, what Christians might call the devotional path to God, is always received by what the Indians call parampara. That is, it is passed from one teacher to the next in a living chain, from ancient times to the present. Srila Prabhupada is best understood, as this book presents him, as one particularly effective link in this chain. Yet, it must be added, Srila Prabhupada was also a unique person. To say that the teachings of the ancient ones come to us through a series of teachers does not mean that the teachers themselves are interchangeable. If they were so faceless, there would be little point in writing a biography of any of them. But this life of Srila Prabhupada is pointed proof that one can be a transmitter of truth and still be a vital and singular person, even in a sense I now feel safe to use, in some ways, original. Srila Prabhupada lived during a particularly critical period in Indian history, that of British colonial rule and its aftermath. He worked with and among dozens of people who befriended, opposed, supported, or ignored him. He initiated Back to Godhead magazine. At what almost anyone would consider a very advanced age, when most people would be resting on their laurels, he hearkened to the mandate of his own spiritual teacher and set out on the difficult and demanding voyage to America. Srila Prabhupada is, of course, only one of thousands of teachers, but in another sense, he is one in 1,000, maybe one in 1,000,000. As a Christian, It is very important and impressive to me that Srila Prabhupada took it upon himself to bring the teaching he so well represents to America. This sentence, I am sure, requires some explanation. First of all, as a Christian, I come from a tradition in which God's sending of someone to bring a vital message to those who desperately need it is held in very high esteem. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, Yahweh sends prophets to remind the people how far they have strayed from his will, to expose the way they have misused the poor and failed to defend the widow and the fatherless. In the New Testament, Jesus sends forth his disciples, 2 by 2, asking them to take along only the scantiest clothing and equipment, telling them to bear the message of peace and salvation to the uttermost parts of the earth. God himself is depicted as sending his only Son into the world on a mission that would ultimately cost him his life. Christians are taught to respect and admire those who are willing to pay the heavy price of leaving comfort and security behind to go somewhere else to carry a message of liberation. Today, however, many Christians have become comfortable and complacent, not only unwilling themselves to engage in such hardship, but often unable even to understand or appreciate those who do. It is a great loss. Even though some people claim it is a good thing that many Christians are no longer as interested in carrying their message to other parts of the world, that they have become less presumptuous or arrogant, I personally believe it has more to do with sloth and the satiety of consumer society than with humility. I have little patience with zealous proselytizing, no matter who inflicts it on whom. I do believe, however, that any spiritual teaching worth following is also worth sharing. When I visited India, living in fact in the very place where Srila Prabhupada's tradition is centered, Vrindavan, I was thankfully received by everyone there, including the sages and holy men, and was asked to share my tradition with them. I spoke to them as a Christian about what Jesus Christ means to me, and about what his teaching has to offer to the world. They listened attentively and gratefully. Their only complaint, as I recall, was that I had not spoken long enough. Indians, unlike Americans, seem in no hurry to rush off to something else if there is a serious spiritual discussion to be followed. Given the fact that I was so well received in Srila Prabhupada's own land, I am sorry that he had his students still often find it so difficult to be heard or to be taken seriously here in America. I am grateful for this book for 2 additional reasons that its writer could not have known. First, the author uses, among other methods, the growingly important method we in the West call oral history. He incorporates the fruits of many interviews with the people who knew Srila Prabhupada or who encountered him, who contribute some little bit of information, however tiny or fleeting, to make up the whole picture. In a few years, all these people will have passed on. Those sources will be lost, at least to our mortal ears, forever. It is extremely important that the writer used this method and used it so very skillfully. I hope others will use it as effectively. Also, perhaps without fully intending to, the author is giving us a portrait of an age, the apex and the nadir of the passing epoch of which might be called Western dominance. He shows us the devastation wreaked by cultural imperialism and demonstrates how stubbornly its destructive residues remain in the mental habits and even in the eating patterns of a previously colonized people, long after the actual political rule of the outsider has been thrown off. Especially since this volume covers that period of Srila Prabhupada's life before he came to America, it is vital to see that he was also instrumental in leading a revival of traditional Indian spiritual and cultural values in India itself before he came to our shores. Since that selfsame phenomenon is now underway, wherever the long arm of European dominance once reached, the book can also be read as an integral part of the growing literature of Third World Cultural Renaissance. Obviously, this volume can be appreciated in many ways. It can also be read, I should add, as the very fascinating story of a very fascinating man. In any case, however, the present reader wishes to approach it, I am glad now to terminate this foreword and allow him or her to get on with the joy of reading. Harvey Cox, Professor of Divinity, Harvard University. Preface. After the disappearance of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada from this mortal world on November 14, 1977, many of his disciples saw a need for an authorized biography of Srila Prabhupada. The responsibility of commissioning such a work rested with the governing body commission of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. At their annual meeting in 1978, the GBC resolved that a biography of Srila Prabhupada should be written, and that I would be the author. According to the Vaishnava tradition, if one aspires to write transcendental literature, he must first take permission from his spiritual master and Krishna. A good example of this is Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, the author of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's authorized biography, Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. As Krishnadas Kaviraj has explained, quote, "In Vrindavan there were also many other great devotees, all of whom desired to hear the last pastimes of Lord Chaitanya. By their mercy, all these devotees ordered me to write of the last pastimes of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Because of their order only, although I am shameless, I have attempted to write this Chaitanya Charitamrita." Having received the order of the Vaishnavas, but being anxious within my heart, I went back to the temple of Madan Mohan in Vrindavan to ask his permission also. Unquote. This transcendental process is further described by His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada in his commentary on the Chaitanya Charitamrita as follows, quote, "To write about the transcendental pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is not an ordinary endeavor, unless one is empowered by the higher authorities or advanced devotees. One cannot write transcendental literature, for all such literature must be above suspicion, or in other words, it must have none of the defects of conditioned souls, namely mistakes, illusions, cheating, and imperfect sense perception. The words of Krishna and the disciplic succession that carries the orders of Krishna are actually authoritative. One must first become a pure devotee, following the strict regulative principles and chanting 16 rounds daily, and when one thinks he is actually on the Vaishnava platform, he must then take permission from the spiritual master, and that permission must also be confirmed by Krishna from within his heart." Unquote. And there was an ellipses in there too. So to say the Srila Prabhupada Lilamrta is an authorized biography does not mean that it is a flattering portrait commissioned by an official body, but that it is an authorized literature presented by one who is serving the order of Krishna and Guru through the disciplic succession. As such, Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is not written from the mundane or speculative viewpoint. Nor can ordinary biographers comprehend the significance and meaning of the life of a pure devotee of God. Were such persons to objectively study the life of Srila Prabhupada, the esoteric meanings would evade them. Were they to charitably try to praise Srila Prabhupada, they would not know how. But because Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is authorized through the transcendental process, it can transparently present the careful reader with a true picture of Srila Prabhupada. Another important aspect of the authenticity of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is the vast amount of carefully researched information that I am able to focus into each volume. The leading devotees of the Krishna consciousness movement, in addition to giving me permission to render this work, have also invited the world community of ISKCON devotees to help me in gathering detailed information about the life and person of Srila Prabhupada. The Bhaktivedanta Book Trust, Prabhupada's publishing house, has given me his collection of letters, totaling over 7,000, and scores of Prabhupada's disciples have granted interviews and submitted diaries and memoirs of their association with Srila Prabhupada. Aside from his disciples, we have interviewed many persons in various walks of life who met Srila Prabhupada over the years. The result is that we have a rich composite view of Srila Prabhupada, drawn from many persons who knew him in many different situations and stages of his life. The acknowledgments section in this book lists the persons who are cooperating to bring about Srila Prabhupada Lilamrta. Despite the authorized nature of this book, and despite the support of my many well-wishers, I must confess that in attempting to describe the glories of our spiritual master, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, I am like a small bird trying to empty the ocean by carrying drops of water to the land. The picture I have given of Srila Prabhupada is only a glimpse into his unlimited mercy, and that glimpse has only been possible by the grace of Guru and Krishna. Satsvarup Das Goswami. Here's a plate or a photo. Srila Prabhupada. Introduction. This volume begins in Calcutta in 1896 with the birth of Abhay Charan De and ends in 1965 with Abhay Charanaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami on his way to New York City aboard the steamship Jaladuta. Footnote. Charanaravinda was the name of Abhay Charan De's spiritual master gave him at his initiation. Bhaktivedanta was a title his godbrothers conferred upon him in recognition of his devotional and scholarly qualities. The title Swami came in 1959 when he entered the renounced order. The worldwide fame of His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, later known as Srila Prabhupada, was to come after 1965, after he arrived in America. Before leaving India, he had written 3 books. In the next 12 years, he was to write 60. Before he left India, he had initiated 1 disciple. In the next 12 years, he would initiate more than 4,000. Before he left India, hardly anyone had believed that he could fulfill his vision of a worldwide society of Krishna devotees. But in the next decade, he would form and maintain the International Society for Krishna Consciousness and open more than 100 centers. Before sailing for America, he had never been outside India, but in the next 12 years, he would travel many times around the world, propagating the Krishna Consciousness movement. It had been predicted in the scriptures and envisioned by great saints. A few of Srila Prabhupada's godbrothers had even tried to make it happen. They had gone to England, only to return convinced that it was impossible. But not until Srila Prabhupada traveled to America did it come to pass that Westerners wholeheartedly took up the life of Vaishnavism and became Krishna-conscious devotees. This story of Srila Prabhupada's spiritual success is narrated in subsequent volumes of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrta. Quote, the nectar of the pastimes of Srila Prabhupada, unquote, beginning with Volume 2. Planting the Seed, New York City, 1965 to 1966. Yet, this present volume, which covers most of his lifetime, telling how he prepared himself for his late burst of revolutionary spiritual activity, is most important. These first 69 years form a complete dramatic life story and do not depend on anything he did later to explain them. Abhay Charan's father, Gaur Mohan De, carefully prepared Abhay from childhood for the life of a pure Vaishnava. Gaur Mohan taught him to worship Krishna and encouraged him, beginning when Abhay was only 5, in his Lord Jagannath cart parade through the streets of Kolkata, their Kolkata neighborhood. A small Rath Yatra festival, the same festival Abhay was later to enact on a magnificent scale in many Western cities. Srila Prabhupada used to say in his later days that whatever principles he had established as leader of the Hare Krishna movement, he had learned in his childhood, with but one important exception: book publication and distribution, which he had learned later from his spiritual master. It was his first meeting with his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, in 1922, that focused Srila Prabhupada's future life into a meditation on how to carry out the mission of preaching Krishna consciousness in the West. After that first meeting, his entire life, his writing, his taking sannyas, his publishing books, and finally his going to the West, became part of his dedication to carrying out the order of this higher authority. Srila Prabhupada's obligation to his wife and children and his attempts to develop a business career in the pharmaceutical industry may appear inconsistent with a single-minded determination to spread Krishna consciousness. Yet his earnestness in pursuing these responsibilities and the way Providence finally extricated him from them proved important in his essential lifetime of preparation. After he left his family responsibilities in 1950, he met with obstacles of obscurity and poverty and an insecurity imposed by the tumultuous times in which he lived. But again, his struggle to continue his mission was part of his preparation. In the light of Srila Prabhupada's unprecedented spiritual achievements in his later life, it seems inevitable that I should say something here about his being empowered by God. According to the Vedic scriptures, the lives of certain individuals are part of God's mission on earth. In the West, Jesus Christ is the best known example. A chosen son sent by God from the spiritual world. And in the East, the Vedic writings tell of various avatars of Lord Vishnu, incarnations of the Supreme Lord, with specific names, characteristics, and activities. Thus, Lord Krishna sometimes appears himself, and he sometimes empowers a particular devotee to do his work. Srila Prabhupada, in his commentary on Chaitanya Charitamrita, explains about souls empowered by Lord Krishna. Quote, "There are two kinds of living entities, Nitya Siddha and Nitya Baddha. The Nitya Siddha never forgets his relationship with the Supreme Personality, whereas the Nitya Baddha is always conditioned, even before the creation. He always forgets his relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. By the order of the Supreme, the Nitya Siddha remains within this material world like an ordinary man, but his only business is to broadcast the glories of the Lord. All Nitya Siddhas within this material world may appear to toil like ordinary men, but they never forget their position as servants of the Lord." Unquote. In determining whether a person is empowered by God, the main consideration is the quality of his work. In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, the scholar Vallabha says to Lord Chaitanya, quote, "The fact that you have spread Krishna consciousness all over the world proves that you have Krishna Shakti, transcendental power from Lord Krishna." Unquote. After Srila Prabhupada's passing away in 1977, his senior godbrother, B.R. Sridhar Maharaj, quoted this same Krishna Shakti verse and applied it to Prabhupada. Unless he had been empowered by Krishna, he could not have spread Krishna consciousness as he did. When we consider Srila Prabhupada's identity as Lord Krishna's empowered representative, the years of struggle described in this volume take on a special sweetness. These years reveal little-known events in the life of a person who was always wrapped in devotional remembrance of Krishna. Although he struggled through many hardships, his struggles were not those of an ordinary man, for he lived solely to carry out the will of Guru and Krishna. I invite the reader to enjoy the very real human life story of Srila Prabhupada, who is known in this volume as Abhay Charan. Satsvarup Das Goswami.